Why is the Vidui confessional prayer in alphabetical order? According to a 16th century Venetian Kabbalistic text, it's because the sinner is destroying the world God created using letters of Torah. In the mystical tradition, the letters themselves form ingredients of the recipe for world making. Creation, according to Bereshit, is tov, good. So chet, sin, unmakes the good. Confession and tshuva remake the good, getting us back on track. If, as Dr. King said and former President Obama often quoted, the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, human failure is that which takes the world from its intended course. And man, are we off track lately. One trend that I think is contributing to our collective departure from that moral arc is the way that we've come to talk past and about one another, particularly online in social media. You may have heard the term cancel culture. It's one of these terms that means so many different things, it's hard to figure out what, if anything, it means at all. For some, it's Twitter mobs, internet shaming, and stifling open debate. For others, it's accountability for those in power, whether men who for years assaulted or harassed women without reproach, or police brutality, or white quote-unquote Karens weaponizing police against black and brown people, like the woman who called 911 because a black birder in Central Park had the audacity to ask her to curb her dog, or the couple who called the cops to report vandalism because it never occurred to them that a Filipino American in their wealthy San Francisco neighborhood could be stenciling Black Lives Matter on his own property. Much has been written about cancel culture. If you want to know more about the endless vagaries of this phenomenon, even if it's one thing, which frankly I don't think it is, read Vox or the New York Times or any one of hundreds of articles on the subject. Meanwhile, I'm more concerned about the arc of the moral universe than I am about the exact meaning of the phrase, or even, despite my own progressive policy leanings, any specific partisan rhetoric on this. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, alea shalom, who will be laid to rest tomorrow, ever the precocious student, wrote an essay for her Brooklyn Synagogue's Hebrew School in 1946 at age 13, 1 year after the Shoah. There can be a happy world, and there will be once again, when men create a strong bond towards one another, a bond unbreakable by a studied prejudice or passing circumstance. On this Yom Kippur, when we consider the effects of using letters, language, and images to shame or harm, I ask us to consider what is strong, what is breakable. Does the universe bend? Do we? Consider the mighty redwood trees. Watching the devastating wildfires out west, I think about loss of life and property. I think about the impact of global climate change. But I've also been pondering the redwoods. Have you been to Big Sur, Muir Woods? Big Basin is the oldest state park in California. It burned last month. But the redwoods will be okay. That's how they're built, to endure forest fires. Their strength and resilience are why they lived hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. Jewish tradition celebrates trees, the terebinths of Mamre, the cedars of Lebanon, but ironically, more than the cedar, it's the lowly reed that captures the rabbinic imagination. The discussion unfolds in the Talmud, in Masachet Ta'anit. The curse with which the prophet Achia Shiloni cursed the Jewish people is better, say the rabbis, than the blessing with which Bil'am the wicked blessed them. How? Rabbi Yochanan explains Achia Shiloni cursed the Jewish people by comparing them to a reed. V'hika Hashem et Yisrael ka'asher yanuda kaneh b'mayim. For the Lord will smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. And what did Bil'am say? The one who came to curse, but whom God forced to bless, the Jewish people would be ka'arazim alei mayim, like cedars beside the water. Cedars big and strong. Blessing. Reeds, short and pliable. Curse. But not so fast. Because as with many things, the cedar's strength is also its weakness. Most winds just bounce off the cedar, but the ruach dromit, the strong southern wind, it rips it from the ground and sends it toppling over. That's why, says the Talmud, Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon taught, Leolam yehe adam rach kekaneh, ve'al yehe kashe ke'erez. A person should always be soft like a reed and not stiff like a cedar. This summer, there was a call to flexibility and intellectual openness in the form of an open letter in Harper's. The letter on justice and public debate was signed by 150 writers, academics, and public intellectuals. It's worth reading, and I largely share the author's concerns about an intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. But perhaps the best demonstration of how fraught it is to say anything in the current political climate is the fallout from the letter itself. For example, author and transgender activist Jenny Boylan tweeted an apology for signing without having had full knowledge of the other signatories. Noam Chomsky, Gloria Steinem, Margaret Atwood were worthy collaborators, it seems, but perhaps not J.K. Rowling, who has made comments condemned by many as transphobic. How might the blessing of the reed, of flexibility, be applied here? For one, I think guilt by association claims on balance do much more harm than good. This argument that should you speak with, stand with, or make common cause with someone, you are somehow endorsing that person's full range of beliefs and prior activities is specious at best. Not only can every person who stands for anything worthy in this world not be held accountable for vetting every other person who may also support that position, this attitude fundamentally undermines the possibility of human growth, assuming that something someone said or believed in the past is what they believe or stand for now, or that we, all of us, are intellectually or morally static and have no possibility of change or growth in the future. But that's just silly. Most of us are in process. This doesn't mean for a moment that my concerns about our culture of public shaming means I think we're not responsible for our failings of word and deed. We are, full stop. Nor does it mean that I think Jenny Boylan in particular made the wrong decision succumbing to public pressure. That's not for me to say. But the question of accountability, while bound up with the question of visibility, must not be synonymous with it. Shining a light into the dark places can reveal hidden sins, to be sure, but I also wonder how many people dunking on the worst person on the internet this week are doing so to create real, lasting, and healthy societal change. To do that, we have to admit that people do change. And internet shaming seems hell-bent on doing the exact opposite. But changing for the better is what Yom Kippur is all about. And changing for the better tends to happen when we allow ourselves to be in relationship with people whose experiences and perspectives challenge our own biases and failings. So Beth Am put a Black Lives Matter sign on our lawn and signed onto the full-page New York Times ad last month, not because we agree with all of the other signatories on every other issue, or necessarily any other issue, and not because we believe every African American voice within the Black Lives Matter movement is devoid of anti-Semitism. It's pretty clear to me that BLM is not an anti-Semitic movement, but that's not the point. We put up the sign, we endorse the letter for one simple reason: because Black Lives matter. And too many people, too many systems and institutions act as if they don't. But I want to interrogate this a bit further, because as evidenced by the Harper's letter, much of the discourse around cancel culture is about the head, and I think we really have to talk about the heart. I used to think America's, strike that, humanity's problem was that we didn't abide ambiguity, complexity, and contradiction. I do still think that that's a problem. Jeffrey Toobin, in his book about the Mueller investigation, says simplicity rarely loses to complexity in battles in the public square. But I'm increasingly convinced that even more than we have an ambiguity problem, we have an empathy problem. Here's what I mean. Ambiguity is an intellectual solution to the problem of binary thinking. Empathy is an emotional one. I used to think that emotions were the problem. People were too emotional, insufficiently analytical. We were too much in our kishkis, not enough trusting evidence, using our minds. But more and more, I think emotions are where solutions are to be found. We have forgotten how to bend, how to care and incline our hearts toward one another. We are cedars and not reeds. Anu kshe oref v'ata erech hapayim, we are stiff-necked, you are patient. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, b'imutz halev. We have sinned against you by hardening our hearts. What about our Jewish tradition? Does it say anything about canceling? Actually, it does. If someone has done something terrible, we have the mechanism of cherem, of excommunication. Cherem is essentially canceling someone. It's social and fiscal isolation. Do you know where the word heresy or heretic comes from? Not cherem, though it sounds kind of similar. It comes from the Greek word heretikos, which means able to choose. Think about that. But Jewish heresy isn't about rejecting dogma. It's about one's behavior. For example, the classic rabbinic behavior for which a husband is put in cherem is refusing to grant his wife a get. And cherem isn't permanent, it's didactic. It's meant to teach him a lesson. Once he does the right thing and liberates his ex-wife from the marriage to which she is no longer devoted, he may be welcomed back into the community. Permanent cancellation is not Jewish because it precludes the possibility of tshuva, of repentance. Now, does this mean that all people are welcomed back? That Harvey Weinstein should be given another chance? There are people in this world whose sins are so great that their capacity to unmake their failures, to do true reparations for their crimes, is doubtful at best. Maybe you can think of a few more people like that. But to conflate the worst perpetrators, the monsters, with the rest of us, who fail plenty but truly wish and work to improve, is to give in to the toxic cynicism of our era, to give up on the essential goodness of God's world and the possibilities for human happiness, about which a young RBG once wrote. The current climate of public shaming risks wielding punishments that surpass most moral infractions. The first thing our kids are taught about internet safety is that you should assume everything online is public and permanent. For any of us who have been called out for something on social media, it hurts. One feels chastened, to be sure, and growth may come from that chastening, but it's hard to separate that out from feeling misunderstood and perhaps misrepresented. And those are the times that there's actual truth behind the accusation. There are no fact checkers on a Facebook thread. To be sure, there's wisdom in books like White Fragility and White Rage that flag the ways folks with power and privilege prioritize their own hurt or embarrassment, and in so doing further harm and disempower others. But Jewish law substantially limits public criticism, not because it's ineffective, but because verbal cycles of public embarrassment carry their own risk of trauma. Tochacha, rebuke, which is mandated by Torah, must be done with the goal of both communal and individual growth. If I shame you to better society, when there's a way to better both you and society, I'm doing it wrong. That's why the midah of anava, the attribute of humility, in the Musar tradition is related to flexibility. Shedding our rigidity is part of recognizing the full humanity of others, even those with whom we disagree, even those who may have caused us harm or offense. Flexibility, in turn, not only allows for our own moral, intellectual, and social development, it can elicit growth in others. We bend, and sure, some people stiffen in return. But other times we bend or bow, and many people, they bow back. Le'olam yehei adam rach kekaneh, ve'al yehei kasher ke'erez. A person should be soft like a reed and not stiff like a cedar hardly means that we should always be bending over backwards to accommodate everyone else. Redwoods can withstand the heat because they're strong. Cedars are powerful and resilient. Justice Ginsburg was no pushover. Her conviction was legendary. But she celebrated what the rabbis call machloket l'shem shamayim, sacred disagreement, the dissenting opinion. And her heart was open and pliable. She cared about people with whom she disagreed, just as she cared about the pursuit of justice. RBG wasn't about canceling. She was about subscribing to people's humanity and then holding them accountable for it. And that's why I think the sages teach that it's the reed and not the cedar that merits to be turned into a kulmus, into a quill. And the quill is used to write a Sefer Torah, the text of a mezuzah, or of tefillin. The instrument of moral assertion should mirror the arc of the moral universe. It should bend. The world is brought into existence through goodness, says the Torah. Sin, the result of human callousness and rigidity, stiffens the world against progress, compassion, and yes, ultimately justice. Our most sacred texts, by way of the quill, are a product of flexibility, and these sources provide guidance for ethical living. Bending becomes holy writing, becomes holy doing. Justice Ginsburg, who proudly displayed the words, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue on the walls of her chamber, wrote many sacred texts during her extraordinary life. For all of her dissenting, for all of her frustration with the court's slow progress and even backsliding, she believed vociferously in the pursuit of justice and never gave up on the human capacity for goodness. How else could she form deep and real relationships with the likes of Antonin Scalia, with whom she so pointedly disagreed? I think about the essay young Ruth wrote in 1946, after the horrors visited upon her people, our people, on the possibilities for a happy world. And I can't help but think of another remarkable young person, born just 4 years before Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That teenager wrote the following on July 15, 1944. I've read these words 100 times. And then you read them again, and you realize what they mean. It's difficult, she wrote, in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us. Only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. That young teenager was, of course, Anne Frank. Our current culture might castigate such a person as foolish and naive. We might say, look what happened to her just 1 year later when her burgeoning and beautiful life was snuffed out. If you're like me, you may notice yourself at times giving in to cynicism. There's so much to feel hopeless about. And as you can tell, I do feel it. But you know what? I wish I could take your hand right now. I wish you could embrace one another. I wish I could more easily channel my 15 or 13-year-old self when I believed in all the possibilities of the universe. This is my prayer, writes the poet Hillel Bavli. Let not my spirit wither and shrivel in its thirst for you and lose the dew with which you sprinkled it when I was young. I'm not saying this is easy, folks. I'm just saying it's right. So I choose the hope of Anne Frank over the cynicism of this moment. I must, because if the arc of the universe is bent by design, if moral courage and holiness are found in flexibility, not stubborn rigidity, if, in addition to open-mindedness, we can remember how to be open-hearted, including, perhaps especially, with other human beings online, then sin, I say this Yom Kippur, is only about preventing the world and all its goodness from unfolding. We need to get out of our way. We need to get out of the world's way. As my former congressman, the late Elijah Cummings, used to say, we're better than this.